acceptable in thy sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. The promise of God is what we hear about once again in the book of the prophet Isaiah this morning that Jane read to us. The exiles, facing exile, facing the destruction of everything that they held dear, are given hope by Isaiah's words. God's promise is not forgotten. God's promise is God's promise. And as with the people of Israel in Isaiah's time, so with each one of us now in our relationship with Christ. God's promise to us is true. God's promise to us is true. And we come this morning to a baptism where two adults are bringing two children to be baptized. Now there's some debate in Christianity about infant baptism, but I'm a huge fan of infant baptism. It's exactly what we should be doing. Because we are a community that is called to nurture our children into growth, into the faith. But we are also a community as Christians. We are constantly people who see ourselves on a journey, on a pilgrimage. We never arrive. We never have it sorted. Because we know that, because we know that the world is tissued with sin, and we know that we fall. But that's why we're here. I keep saying this, but that's why we're here. Because we understand, we're not here because we're all perfect and the rest of the world is rubbish. We're here because we know that truth. And these parents want to raise their children in that truth. And that comes to our reading from Matthew this morning. Often seen to be a reading that kind of makes you think like, oh God, have I received the word and tossed it aside? Am I the one in which the devil has taken hold of my heart and taken me away? No. We're all of them at different times in our spiritual journey. Because the word, as Isaiah says, comes forth from God and never ceases. And never does it not present, never does it actually give fruit. And the other point to see about the parable of the sower is how the sower sows. Now you ask any farmer in the ancient world and say this is the best way to sow your seed, it's not a great idea. Tossing the seed like this, just all over the place. And you plant it, and you carefully say, no, tossing the seed is totally practical, it's totally sort of crazy, but it's wonderfully generous. Because a seed isn't something that God has, which is like seed might be scarce. The seed of grace, which is God's grace that God pours upon us, is scattered wildly by God. Because God's grace is there for anyone, for all of us, for everyone. And God is that generous that God is willing to waste. Is willing to waste. Because he knows that there will be fruit. There will be fruit from that waste because God is an abundant God. There's abundance in God. There's no scarcity. There's no scarcity with the seed of grace. Grace is just poured out. We live in a world in which, I keep saying this, but it's true, a world in which scarcity, we are told that everything is scarce. Well, there's lots of questions we get out of that. But in God's world, there's nothing but abundance. In God's giving, there's nothing but abundance. God pours out Godself to us. And God pours out his grace just like the sower scattering the seed like this, throwing it out some of it falling not on very profitable ground, some of it falling on very profitable ground. And the point is that grace is always open to us. And the point is, yes, sometimes we fail to receive it. Sometimes we get caught up for all sorts of reasons, in ways we don't receive it, but often it does bear fruit in our hearts. And that's what the Christian journey is about. It's about learning how to bear more fruit from the grace that God pours into us. That's what being a Christian is about. Learning to work with God's grace. It's not even work with God's grace, is it really? It's learning to open ourselves more fully to God's grace. That's a journey of holiness. It's not a journey towards perfection, but it's a journey towards greater holiness. And so, starting off early is really important. So as these parents bring these children to be baptized this morning, we can reflect on our own baptisms. Or maybe we may be reflecting on being baptized. We haven't yet been baptized, but are considering being baptized. We can reflect upon those and think about where we are in our journey of faith. Where we are, how do we feel in relation to God's promises to us and the promises that we make or are going to make in our baptisms. God is a faithful God. God never turns away from us. We may turn away from God, but God never, ever turns away from us. That's a story that's in the Old Testament. God never deserts God's people. And God does not desert us. And God continually scatters His grace, like the sower of the seeds, like the parable of the sower, scatters His grace upon us. And are we going to receive it? Are we going to open our hearts? Are we going to be, today, fruitful ground? And the other thing also we have to think about is, do we make space to help people cultivate fruitful ground? So often I think, and this is something which perhaps might not be popular, but so often I think the church gets in the way. The church itself as a body is not very fruitful ground for which people to grow. It cuts people off, it pushes people away. And so therefore it's not just about individuals and whether we are open to God's grace, it's about the church. And whether the church prevents people from being able to open their hearts to God because of how the church is. And that's part of what we're trying to explore here in our All God's People project. How do all people in all our diversity, how do we make this space, this church, a place in which people from all backgrounds and diversity can grow in Christ? From all different corners of the world. Different sexualities, different genders. How do we make this space a place where people can flourish in who they are and learn to grow in holiness together? That's what being a Christian is about. That's what we're baptizing these two children into today. The journey towards holiness, the growth in Christian faith. Are we, as a community, up to the task of providing a space where God's grace can be poured into all our hearts, whoever we are, wherever we're coming from, and we might know the liberating love of God for ourselves